Okay, so let's look at the P mode, also known as the program mode, or commonly known as point and shoot. As the name suggests, the camera will decide on the best settings, so that all you have to do is just point and shoot, just like a compact camera. What the camera is actually doing is it's automatically setting the optimal aperture and shutter speed according to the brightness of the subject. Now you may think that this is the same as auto mode, but the P mode, the program mode, gives you more control over settings like ISO, the white balance, the actual metering, the light metering, and pretty much every other setting, as opposed to what you can do in the auto mode. The auto mode is completely locked down. So let's get into program mode by turning the mode dial up the top to the P, and let's set up first some menu systems on the program mode. First, you will need the super control panel to be able to be accessed on the program mode. So you need to go into the custom menu, and then in here you need to go to control settings, and then here you can see the program, aperture, shutter and manual, and then from there you can see that you can choose which one you can have the live control or the super control panel. So let's just have the super control panel. So if we get out of that, so now when you press the OK button, you'll have the super control panel. In program mode, you'll have ISO. You can change that. I prefer to have it on auto. The white balance, you can also change the other settings as well. So now that you're in program mode, you'll see down here that's your aperture, and then that's your shutter speed. So, and this is your exposure compensation. You can change the exposure compensation if you want to do it by stops. So that's 1/3, 2/3 and 1 full stop. So what that's just doing is it's increasing, it's letting more light in, so increasing the brightness. Or you can go the other way, 1/3, 2/3, 1 full stop from the current exposure. So the lens I've got on this is the kit lens, and the highest aperture that it can open up to is 3.5. So the program mode has set it to the highest aperture first, and it's equated that it needs 1/25 of a second speed of light to come in. So if you increase the light or decrease the light, these two settings here are going to change the aperture and the shutter speed. So for instance, if I add some more light, you'll see that the shutter speed is increasing. So to keep a proper exposure, what it needs, the computer in the camera is saying, well, obviously I want to keep a correct exposure. You've added more light, so I'm going to decrease how much light is coming in by making the shutter speed much faster. So if heaps more light comes in, like a sunny day, you'll see there's two things changing. The ISO, because we're on auto, it'll try and adjust that as well, and it'll also try and adjust the aperture as well. So see there, I've increased the light and the aperture is going up, which means it's trying to shut down the aperture to let less light in, and also increase the shutter speed as well to let light in, less light in. So the computer is thinking, I want to keep the best exposure, so I'm going to try and figure it out by determining how much light there is. So that's kind of how the program mode works. So they talk about the three factors: ISO, shutter and aperture. As if you notice this scene here now, it's quite dark, so it has increased the ISO, because it's on ISO auto, to 1600. So that's another thing that you need to look out for as well, what it's doing. So for instance, if I add more light, it's going to say, well, I don't need as a high ISO because I've got enough light to, burn the image, burn the sensor. So it uses all three actually when you're in program mode, not just these two. If I put it in ISO 200, if I take it out of auto, ISO 200 is the usual recommended ISO. I think that's like from the film days. So now that's set at ISO 200. So what will change now is only the shutter speed and the aperture. So another way to control the exposure is there's two ways to do it. There's increase the exposure compensation by using the front dial. So, and as you can see, the way that it wants to add more light, by me telling it I want to add more light using the exposure compensation, is to reduce the speed of the shutter speed. So that's what, 1 second. If I want to go brighter, that's 1.3 seconds. So 2 seconds. So that's saying, oh well, you wanted to make it brighter by increasing the exposure compensation. So the way that I'm going to do that is by opening up the shutter speed for a longer time to let more light in. So that's how the exposure compensation works. Another way to control the image while you're in program mode is to use program shift. So what that is you can use the back button to go clockwise or anti-clockwise, and that will change the settings of the exposure. So what program shift mode does is it tries to pick the best aperture and shutter speed for that scene. Just like it is in normal program mode, program shift will just let you select a alternate value of equal exposure. When it's in normal program mode, the exposure there will be 3.5 aperture and 1/20th of a second. So, but if I want to change that scene, and I say I want to get more depth of field, for instance, because I know that at 3.5 I won't get as much depth of field. So if you go clockwise, it'll try and increase the aperture. See how it's increasing the aperture by each time I turn the dial. And obviously, because we're in program mode, it'll reduce the shutter speed. Same again if there's more light. So for instance, let's get more light in there. Alright, so I'm in program normal. If I go anti-clockwise, it's trying to open up the aperture a bit more by dropping the f.5, f4, and alternatively, like I said before, the shutter adjusts to compensate for the light. And then 3.5, my camera it can only open up to 3.5, the lens. So if I keep on going more, see I'm turning the dial now anti-clockwise, nothing's happening because I've opened the aperture as much as I can. So really there's two ways. You can use the program shift to increase the aperture or decrease the aperture, and the shutter speed will adjust accordingly, or you can use exposure compensation. So you might be thinking, well, why do I need to change the settings? The scene is fine as it is. Well, controlling the aperture size affects the depth of field. So program shift's a good way to manipulate that. So for instance, you can use the program shift to affect the depth of field. At the moment, I'm focused in on those baseballs. So, and it's at 4.5 the aperture. If I want to make that pot plant in the background a little bit blurrier, I can use the program shift to reduce by going anti-clockwise, and now that will take a photo and the background will be a little bit blurrier. You can't really see with that only two stops there, but if you do it the other way, I'll show you, you can see what it's actually doing. if I want to increase the sharpness of the background beyond the baseballs, then I need to reduce the aperture size. So if I go clockwise, remember the shutter speed will always be looked after by the camera. So I'm increasing it, and so let's go to f13, and you'll notice now the depth of field is much better. See there? Now, if that's wide open at f3.5, because what you're seeing on the screen is always wide open. So the biggest your aperture can open is what you actually see all the time when you're looking at through the viewfinder or the EVF. I've got a little feature here called depth of field preview. So when you move the aperture to f13 or whatever higher, you don't actually see the depth of field preview. So I've got a little button there. So at f13, or the other way is you just take a photo. So at f13, you'll see now, if I go into it, that the shot is much more in focus beyond the two baseballs. That's one way you can use the program shift to your advantage. So another thing is the shutter speed and the aperture display will blink if the camera is unable to achieve the correct exposure. So if the shot's too dark, you'll get blinking on the shutter and the aperture ones here. So I'll show you, say for instance it's too dark, you'll see it starts flashing. That means it can't take the photo. It means there's not enough light, so you need to add light by adding a flash or whatever, or moving to a sunnier spot. If it's too bright as well, the camera will try and raise the shutter speed up to like 4000. That's the highest it can go on the OMD EM10. But even if it's too much light still, even when the shutter speed is at 4000 for a second, those two things here will flash, will blink, sorry. And then what you'll need to do is either get out of the sun or reduce the light. You can use ND filters and things like that. Okay, so thanks for watching. That's it. I'll move on to the aperture priority mode next video. So that's program shift mode for you. Obviously you need to take, it's a good mode just for beginning, to get out there and just take some photos, let the camera decide what to do, and then you can use the program shift. You can use the compensation, exposure compensation, muck around with the ISO. If it's too dark, increase the ISO. You can play around with the depth of field by using the program shift. So increase the aperture if you want to get longer things in focus. If you want to get a blurry background, reduce the aperture down to the lowest you can, depending on what lens you've got. So I'll see you next video.